Donc là, on va avoir 40 minutes à peu près de discussion, table ronde autour d'un thème, disons-le, très d'actualité, hein, les OSPO. Donc on a un panel d'intervenants très intéressants. Donc je vais vous laisser vous présenter chacun votre tour.
Yes.
Et puis donc là, vous avez des micros qui fonctionnent. Je peux vous faire...
Vous m'entendez là? Excellent. I think...
Oui.
Just a few things. I think that we need to switch to English, if you don't mind.
It's okay for everyone.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
let's go.
I'm the leader of this session.
Yes.
So okay. And I'm so excited about it. Okay, good. So I'm Gaël Blondel. I'm VP Ecosystem Development of the Eclipse Foundation, and I'm also the president of the program of Open Source Experience this year. And I'm very happy to be here with this group of people for a roundtable about OSPO as a catalyzer for good open source governance. So yeah, first of all, so we have Paola
Grzegorzewska.
Thank you, Paola. Sorry. Who's a senior policy advisor at Open Forum Europe. Leslie Hawthorne, who is part of the office of CTO at Red Hat. Dennis Cooper, who is founder and chair of Inner Source Commons. And Cedric Thomas, who is the CEO of OW2. And yeah, we have what's really interesting, in my opinion, and just as an introduction, is that we have tons of experience here about OSPOs for, I would say, the last 15 years, maybe up to what is really moving now and what we are planning for the future. So that's what we will present you today. But maybe first of all, I will give you 2 minutes to each of you to explain your implication in open source and what brings you here today. So let's start with you, Paola.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, hi, I'm Paola Grzegorzewska, and I'm a senior policy advisor at Open Forum Europe, and I've been doing it now for 3 years. So our main field of work is working with policymakers and talking about digital policies, but in terms of openness. So we don't only work on open source, but also on open data, on some other, I don't know, on the cloud stack and other ideas. And now we are looking at OSPOs a lot because it's actually started to pick up in the public sector. It came from the private sector, I would say, a couple of years ago, but I will talk about it a bit later. But yeah, we have also conducted a study on the impact of open source for the European Commission, and we actually found quite interesting results in terms of the GDP and the economic growth that is connected to open source. I will also mention it later. So yeah, thank you.
Hello everyone, Leslie Hawthorne. Within Red Hat's office of the CTO, I'm a member of our open source program office. In particular, I focus on Red Hat's engagement with vertical industry-based communities, so folks in FSI, telco, and automotive. As far as my connection to OSPOs as a construct for affecting positive change in our businesses, in our governments, and in our universities, I have been involved with open source program offices throughout my career. I always say, like, I was an early employee of an early OSPO, and then I'm sitting next to Denise, so I'm not going to say that. But I was an early member of Google's open source program office and worked with the Google Summer of Code program for several years. And I am here today because I am, like I'm sure everyone at this table will reiterate, seeing a greatly increased interest in the idea of creating an open source program office, particularly in the business domain, for helping create and set an open source strategy for companies who are recognizing that one of their key differentiators is how effectively they manage their software development practices, and their recognition that the best way to do software development practice is to engage with open source communities or to produce their own open source software. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Denise Cooper. She was making fun of me earlier because I started the first open source program office in the world when I worked at Sun. That's just the first one that was named that, right? But it did seem to take off as a 4-letter acronym, and you're going to see it a lot over the next few months because, as Paula said earlier, the European area is getting ready to have up to 20 funded OSPOs in both academia and municipal government. And the EU itself has started an OSPO, so you're going to hear a lot about it. What an OSPO does is it helps an organization create focus around open source activities within the organization. And the best OSPOs do what Leslie was talking about with the Google Summer of Code. It's not only about, in open source, about mending your own fences. We like to leave more mended fence than we need or create more value than we try to monetize. So coming up with ways to be of service to the open source community without upsetting your business model is part of the what the OSPO is supposed to do. And Google Summer of Code was one of the first really good hacks in this direction. So there are levels of OSPO involvement, and the best of them are not only selfish.
Thanks, Elise. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cedric Thomas, and I run OW2. So a quick word on OW2 and a quick word of what I'm doing here, as per GAIA's requirements. OW2 is a non-profit organization founded in 2007. Our mission is to promote a code base of open source software for information systems. So we are not into the small libraries or the scientific computing. We really are looking at providing software freely accessible for SMEs and large companies or companies of all sizes and all sorts when they want to make their information system more productive, more efficient, more modern. So we make open source software available to them. So we have like some 20 good, nice software that can fit easily into any kind of information system. They are state-of-the-art software. So when I'm saying this, talking about information systems, you realize that I'm not talking about development tools or software engineering. And in fact, we realize that we are addressing the needs of non-IT people. So we realized that we are engaged with people that are not very familiar with open source or with all the best practices of open source and all that, and they just look at this software. It's free. Well, it's not big, no big brand, no that. And we realized that we are more and more, as open source grows, the surface, the scope, and we reach parts of the market that had never heard of open source software. Part of the markets that have been trained and educated by proprietary software vendors, and we realized that we need to address and speak their language, and that's why we launched 2 years ago 2 initiatives. A push initiatives called Market Readiness Levels, where we help present our project, our software, in a way that is meaningful for business decision makers. And another way, which could be the pool, which is called the Good Governance Initiative, where we try to educate these people on how to manage open source and be familiar, be more comfortable with open source software more easily. So this is what we do, and that's why I'm here this afternoon. Thanks for the invitation, Gael.
Yep. So, well, one thing maybe to add and to explain a bit about the open source good governance initiative, that in June we created with Open Forum Europe and OW2, the Équipes Foundation, the Foundation for Public Code, what we call the OSPO Alliance. And that today we publish the first version of the open source good governance handbook. So that's a printed version, but yeah, you can also find it online. But we will come back to that and in a few minutes. So yeah, maybe just to start. So Denise, you told us that you were creating the first OSPO at Sun, or at least you were part of the first team that was called on OSPO. So tell us more about how it happened and why you think it's important, and it puts the framework for what we hear today.
So Sun, for those of you who don't remember Sun, was an important thing. Even, well, right about 10 years ago, we started to see cracks in the facade. But Sun was very closely tied to the internet taking over the world. And for the first many years of the internet being the World Wide Web, it was run on Sun hardware, and they even designed their own chips, and they were very expensive pieces of hardware, boutique-y even. And one of the big shifts that the rise of Linux brought around was people choosing instead to use, cheaper x86-based boxes to create the same effect as a SPARC station. It took a lot more of them, but they were so much cheaper that people were interested in moving in that direction, starting with the financial markets. Well, very early, basically the year that the term open source was coined, Sun decided that open source was one of the things that they should be paying a lot of attention to. And before they were sold to Oracle, they actually open sourced every piece of software that they produced over a period of years. And I was hired to oversee that trend, but not everybody in the company thought that it was a good idea. In fact, there was a lot of sentiment pushed against open source because it was such early days. And so the real goal was to get Solaris open sourced in time to head off Linux, which obviously they didn't get it together in time. But they did do some interesting projects. OpenOffice is one of those projects. And somebody had to be the focal point for questions, disambiguating when issues come up, being the ombudsman to the outside open source community who, forever wanted more than Sun was giving. And that became my job. And initially it was just me. Within the years that I held that office, which it's been misreported that I stopped doing that in 2004, but it's actually 2005, there were many other people that came on board to work on open source at Sun as it became a rolling thunder kind of thing. But initially it was just me. And somebody tried to fire me every quarter for 5.5 years because shooting the messenger is a very popular thing in big companies in America. But I got very good at surfing the culture, and I managed to survive for 6 whole years. And in the last 6 months that I was doing that job, everybody wanted to take credit for all the work that I had done and all the risk that I'd taken. And I was very upset about it initially, and then I thought, this might mean that I'm winning and I could leave. So when I coach change agents now, I always say you're going to know that you're winning when you start hearing other people say the things you said as though they thought of it, especially if they're bosses above you. So open source program office running is a low-level job for doers, typically. In fact, there's even an art to deciding whether you want to work in somebody's OSPO based on where they've put it in the company. If it's in the marketing department, run away. Seriously, just run away. It needs to be in engineering because you'll have no influence otherwise. So we made it up as we went along, and shortly after my OSPO started, everybody started having one. Several of them already had one, but they didn't have a name for it. It was just an informal group. And because I was the chief evangelist for open source, that made me C-level in Sun. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to do it too. So
great. Leslie, fast forward. And maybe you tell us about your involvement in OSPO++, in to-do group, and this kind of how we came from this first initiative to this kind of now the different communities being built around the concept of OSPO.
Okay, I will do my best to answer that question well. So as someone who's spent her career doing community building, I always think it's important for there to be collaboration amongst community groups trying to solve common problems, because that way we can take the best best practices that we can share amongst each other. And for what doesn't work in one particular area, that's also fine too. So I got my start in groups who are focusing on the process of architecting open source program offices about, my goodness, 4 or 5 years ago, when I became Red Hat's representative to the To-Do group for the European Union chapter. And the To-Do group is a group within the Linux Foundation who focus on the work required by open source program officers to serve their companies in a wide variety of ways. So this is sharing best practices around things like, how do we ensure software license compliance? How do we create an open source strategy for our large enterprise? To what extent do we need to staff such a large enterprise, et cetera? I always think it's very interesting to think about the origins of the To-Do group. I wasn't around when this happened, but it was one of those, stories of lore that passes through the community. That the original founder of To-Do group, Chris Anichek, was head of open source at Twitter. And the To-Do group actually started, as I understand it, as a group of folks who were working in tech companies within open source program offices who would all get together at the Thirsty Bear pub in downtown San Francisco on, if I remember right, Wednesday evenings to commiserate about how everyone understood that what they did was really important to the company, but no one understood what they did, why it was important to the company, or why they should give them any more budget or respect within the organization. So it was kind of like there's a support group and we meet at the bar kind of thing when it started. Fast forward to many years later, and the To-Do group, after Chris Anichek moved into employment with the Linux Foundation, then later with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and brought the To-Do group kind of along with him as part of that joining, has, literally, I think it's up above 100 members, and it's really focused on, again, knowledge sharing and best practices sharing amongst practitioners who are within open source program offices, so that those who are either in businesses and new to understanding that they need to have an open source program office or an open source strategy have a way to find that information. There's any number of guides on the internet that have been published by the To-Do group. They're all under an open copyright. You can find them at todogroup.org. And then the European Union chapter formed, which is where I show up in the story, around, like I said, 4 or 5 years ago. We've put together a white paper on the business value of open source to be used as collateral for talking to folks in the C-suite who may be less familiar with why open source is useful to their firm, particularly if they're coming from more traditional industries where, to quote Cedric's point, that these folks have been educated by proprietary vendors on how they should think about their software strategy, and they're only now discovering that there are options in open source that may be better and more beneficial for their business. So that's To-Do EU. Then I will let other people talk about OSPO Alliance more because I have been to a few calls and I'm a big fan of their work. Speaking of other folks with whom I am a big fan of their work and have been to a couple calls, the OSPO++ folks, and I know Denise is more deeply involved there, are focused really rigorously on the space of creating OSPOs within government organizations or within universities. And as someone who spent a lot of her early career working with university students, in fact, even working at a university for a brief time with students focused on open source software, that's a cause that's near and dear to my heart. But I don't think I should be the one covering it because there are people who know more than me. Thank you.
Yeah, Kyle.
You want to say a few words about the OSPO++? Go ahead.
So OSPO++, what you're hearing is there are 3 organizations that talk a lot about that 4-letter acronym OSPO. The To-Do group is focused mostly on what do tech companies do with each other. And they're starting to branch out into what do other software producing companies do, but really most of their advice is focused on a certain setup where there are programmers available, where there's a lot of money typically, relative to how a municipal government feels about its money, right? So I met this guy named Jacob Green, who's sitting in the front row here. About 4 years ago, he sidled up to me at a conference and asked if he could hang out with me long enough to understand what open source means. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And so we've been around the world a couple times looking at open source, and his need to look at it had to do with he lives in a town that could really use some help. He lives in a town called Baltimore, Maryland. And if any of you have ever seen The Wire, that's apparently a documentary about his town. So he thought that given that the institutions weren't really holding up their end of the rope, maybe the community could organize to do that work themselves. And he brought in Saeed Chowdhury, who's sitting next to him in the front row, who works in the library of Johns Hopkins, a large university, in fact, the largest research institution in America, which just happens to be headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, which means they're trying to hire people from around there, and they have a good vested interest in Baltimore, getting better. And so he created an open source program office, the first one ever at Johns Hopkins, and almost immediately started working for the community centers that actually do most of the citizen work right now in Baltimore, because the main things are kind of screwed up, right? So they're the people that live in that town are fixing it themselves. And so they used the software that if you live here in Paris, you use anytime you want to talk to the local government. You need a marriage license, where do you go? Lutes, right? You need pretty much anything that you need to do in this town that goes through City Hall, you got to look at Lutes, right? That is an open source body of work that's really impressive. 217 separate services that do nothing but help Paris do a good job of serving its citizens. And so those two gentlemen, Jacob and Saeed, started working on using that software in Baltimore. And they have created the first sort of public-private partnership around open source in Baltimore, but they're also one of the first major users of that Lutes code base, even though it was open source 12 years ago. So OSPO++ took a really hard turn in the direction of Paris, and we have spent an inordinate amount of time here talking to the city and helping them figure stuff out, so much so that they're right on the edge of saying that they're maybe going to have an open source program office in the city of Paris now. Should be great. So that's what OSPO++ is. We've done a lot of work directly with academia and with municipal governments, and we've not done any work with technical companies because they're already well supported by To-Do. So.
Thanks, Denise. Paola, tell us a bit about open source in Europe and this idea of creating lots of OSPOs, and that was framed in your study.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Denise, started with a good introduction, because we have all these amazing people and all these amazing groups that are working on OSPOs, and OSPO++ is focusing a bit more on the public sector, and this is something that we are doing right now. So actually, exactly 1 year ago, 1 year ago and 2 weeks, the European Commission started their own OSPO, and this is a great achievement and a great step that is showing other public administrations that they can do it as well, because our first idea was that, probably because the private sector has been doing it for so long, and as we know, Denise has been involved for so long. So, I mean, probably the public sector took inspiration from it and is starting. I have to say that, I mean, from the discussions that I've had so far, it's not necessarily the case. They're looking up more into other public sector institutions. So when the European Commission has started such a program office that is actually institutionalizing and professionalizing their involvement in open source, then other administrations and all levels can take some inspiration and maybe think about starting something on their own. So we think here about universities, we think here about cities, we think here about regions, we think here about national governments or ministries. So there's a lot to think about, how to organize it, what the interface should be, if we should, I don't know, issue a guideline that is helping them to organize it. But, should it be a different one for a university and a different one for a national government? How such a network could look like? And for this, we need the involvement of the public sector itself and public officials who are actually working on this. So actually, currently, we're researching this, and it's a small report that we're working on, but we are talking to the public sector officials and just asking them, why do you do open source in your institution? Why do you plan to institutionalize it? Why do you think of even setting up an OSPO? Is it more an operational goal? So for example, you have a public official that is doing something on open source in their unit. But it's not really necessarily in their job description, but you need resources for this. And if you want to really get engaged, you need to have it in your job description. And I don't know, that on Tuesday or on Thursday you do open source, or just manage a community or engage in it, or just organize the resources that you have. And right now for these, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years, we see the growth of this actual institutionalization. So we don't only have open source heroes in governments, we start to have people who actually have it in their job description. And this is a tremendous thing that is happening right now, and there is a need for support for all these initiatives. And I know that many governments are looking at this literally right now, and there might be some announcements, and there have been, of course, in the recent times. And it's not only national, but it's also global, and again, on the level of the European Commission, for example. But we see this shift, and what I also wanted to talk about, it's a study that we conducted, and actually I heard that it has been quoted quite sometimes during this conference, so I mean, this is quite amazing. So Open Forum Europe and Fraunhofer ISI conducted a study on the impact of open source, and we focused on the economic impact of open source. So the idea was to look at the numbers, which hasn't been done in Europe since 2006, because that was the previous study that the Commission ordered, to be conducted. So here we come over 15 years afterwards, and we see that actually open source is contributing extremely to the European economy. So we saw that in 2018, in Europe, over 1 billion euros has been invested in open source, and it's actually bringing extremely good economic results. So, of course, our policymakers can think that this is, open, collaborative. I mean, it's good just for our digital autonomy. That's a big word, big phrase in Brussels right now. But we also need the results, and our study actually provided the results that it makes sense economically for the European citizens to have more open source services, to have more open source software being developed, and that's why the government should engage with this, and now they see it. And yeah, I wanted the one more thing that I really wanted to talk about is this recommendation of having a network of 20 OSPOs in Europe. So this is actually one of the main recommendations that we have in our report. It's a report of almost 400 pages, so to make it too long, didn't read. We would like to see a network of 20 OSPOs in the European Union, and the goal is to have an interface for different people to interact with such an OSPO. So you have an OSPO in the private sector, and it's interested in providing a particular service, or just addressing a particular need that such a public institution has. And they can do it through contacting the OSPOs. It's very often a pretty simple thing of having a person that you can reach out to, and that you have to reach out to because you're interested in providing a service, or you have a solution for this particular problem of the city of Paris. And actually here you have a person that you can contact. You go to the website and you see where you should go. In many places there is no such thing. And what I have found so far is also that very often in the public sector you don't need this much resources actually to start something like this. Very often governments and institutions are starting with an MVP. So, they have a couple of people who are interested in just spending a couple of hours per week on doing this. And actually so far it seems to be working. And, there are some people who are actually, just putting a lot of money into this, a lot of effort, a lot of planning. But there is a way to do it, pretty simply, and just to start with something and start to engage with a community. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to highlight for sure.
Thanks, Paula. So, well, just to come back to the OSPO Alliance a bit. So, yeah, in June we created this this new initiative, and I would paraphrase what Denise said, that the to-do group is really about what do tech companies do. OSPO++, like you described it, is about OSPOs in universities and municipalities. And the unique positioning on what we want to do with the OSPO Alliance is really OSPOs for the EU ecosystem, and going beyond OSPO for software vendor, but also creating the blueprint, the framework for OSPOs for the industry. The idea is really, and I think that's certainly more, even more true in Europe. Open source is eaten the software. Yeah, software has eaten the world, and open source has eaten software. And so we see that even in the more traditional industry, we have everybody thinking about open source, and we have, for example, automotive players wondering how to do open source better, etc. And that's really the kind of organizations we want to address with the OSPO Alliance. And that stands on 3 pillars. The first pillar is discover open source, because in those companies, most of the time, the first people to get interested in open source are lawyers, and sometimes that may create trouble, I would say. But I guess that there will be other talks about that later in the afternoon. So discover open source, and we want to help also the business people to better understand the implications of doing open source. Understand open source with more material to really understand, for example, open source compliance, but also open source communities, etc. And the last pillar is implement open source, and implement open source is where I give you the stage, Cedric, because that's really, for the moment, that really relies on the good governance handbook. Mm. And tell us what is in the good governance handbook.
Wow, it's a great transition, Gael. Thank you. Yes, so you have the to-do group, the OSPO++, the Open Source Alliance. The thing is, we started looking at how people could absorb and consume open source software. Even before I had heard of the acronym OSPO, I had not heard, so it's very popular, but maybe 3 years ago I had never heard of the term before. But, and yet it's a very historical, it goes way back. The problem we had is that when we start talking to people that are not really familiar with open source software, is that there's been a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubts spread all over the market, and people look at open source software from the standpoint of the legal compliance. And for us, because we are here promoting open source and the open source, not way of life, but open source first mindset when you develop software, we know it's not only about licensing, but also best practices, and there is all sorts of, and behavior and all that. And that's something we felt needed to be conveyed to all these users. As we started discussing, we realized that there was one way to address this, was to give people like a checklist of things to do. I mean, like a roadmap, a blueprint on what you should look at before you absorb or you go to one of our open source vendors, some of our members at W2, and they say, well, yeah, but we are confronted with this proprietary vendor, which is more, has a bigger name and more reassuring for the mainstream or the conventional business decision maker. So the idea was really to talk the language for the decision maker and make them comfortable. But we also realized that it had to go way beyond legal compliance. So it's not just about applying, checking, and licensing compatibilities and these sort of things, but also about the open source way. There is the Apache way, so it could be the open source way. And we eventually, from discussions, we started launching what we call the Good Governance Initiative. So it didn't have this name at first. It's an initiative because it's organized in the framework of W2. But at W2, an initiative is a joint effort between members and non-members to address a market need. So we have some of our members working in it, but also it's open to non-members of OW2. And we've started working very informally on that, and then gradually we picked up speed, momentum. So we had meetings every other month, then every month, and then lately we had meetings, calls every week. And we started working on something. And the something we've been working on is something that we are actually announcing today, which is the Open Source Good Governance Handbook. So it's a real methodology. So it's not just talk about open source. We're not lobbying about open source. Also, we do a bit lobbying about open source, yes, open source. But we produce something that is tangible. And in this, you have the blueprint for, I would say, implementing an OSPO or not OSPO. You call it the way you like. But the aim is to make sure that you manage open source software in a way that is professional, predictable, measurable, and you can report to the hierarchy. So it makes the whole organization comfortable with having open source. And the idea is that with this, our objective is that to make using and managing open source software as structural and systematic in the IT department, as there is the network team, the data management team, the GDPR people, or whatever. So there will be in a IT organization somebody, call it OSPO or not, that somebody or team that will have the keys, the best practices, the knowledge, the expertise, and be of good advice on how to implement open source. So when I say implement, it can be producing open source, not producing as much open source as those that are in the to-do group, but also producing, because most users also produce software. And the idea is to give them, well, just to get inside the methodology, it's very simple. Think of 5 goals. First goal is to use open source properly, technically, efficiently, properly. Second goal is to use it in a way that is trustworthy, that is protected from vulnerabilities, legal conflicts, and technical conflicts with managing dependencies. So that's trustworthy goal. The third goal is about culture, making sure that those who consume or produce open source software do that with a proper open source mindset, not doing it like if doing something illegal or no. There is an open source community out there. People, you can communicate in mailing lists, you can open up, you can report bugs, just be open. That's the culture goal. And that's at the individual level. The fourth goal is called engagement goal. The engagement goal is more at the organization level. We want the organizations to be proud. We have some of our members complaining that some organizations were using the software, but would not commit to help develop a use case or be quoted. No, there's no shame in using open source software, so you can do that. But you can just come here, attend conferences, do presentations, conference, help other people use open source software. So that's the engagement goal. So the organization gives back to the community, gives back and contributes to the sustainability of the open source ecosystems because we need them. And that also means subscribing to subscription plan, etc., and giving some money back to the developers. And the fifth goal, we call it strategy goal, is making sure that using open source software is not done in a corner hidden somewhere, but it's visible throughout all the levels in the hierarchy up to the top, and that the whole organization stands behind using open source software, and that is not something that can be washed away in 3 months' time because some management might change or whatever. So 5 goals: usage, trust, culture, engagement, and strategy. And for that, we produce for each goal 5 what we call canonical activities. So we suggest 5 activities. So for trust goal, there are 5 activities you can do, etc. Now, this is very theoretical, but this is where now we go one step further. So we've produced this, and we have to customize these activities because we know we're offering canonical activities, but they have to be adapted to the specifics of each organization. A retail organizations, a transportation company, a utility company, a school, a hospital. I mean, these organizations have different structures, but their culture may be different, their organizations may be different, etc. So the person in charge of this can take that and then use what we call the customized activity scorecard. So you take one activity and you adapt it to your own needs. So there will be no two customized activity scorecards the same. They will all be very different. And that's how we can adapt and make sure. And we're working, again, I mean, they've been quoted several times, the City of Paris, and the City of Paris is an OW2 member. Lutes is one of the OW2 projects. So the City of Paris is using this in both ways, both as a producer of software and as a user of software. And we've been working with them in a way, beta testing this methodology. So this is published, you can have it now. But now we are moving into the real thing, and we realize that it takes like an hour to take one canonical activity and to transfer it into a customized activity scorecard. And when you have the deck of activity scorecards, you have your roadmap, you have your plan, and you have the way to measure progress and to report it to the managers. So
Sounds easy.
That's the. I don't think it is easy. That's the good governance initiative.
Okay, thanks, Cedric. Just as a conclusion, because I think we are running out of time. Of course, you don't need to get this nice book because we just printed 5 of them, so that's a very
for sure. That's for the show.
Just for the show. But if you go to ospo.zone, so ospo.zone, then you can find the PDF, or you can also find everything activity by activity. And that's, I think that it's important also to mention that it's also, everything is licensed under CC BY, so that's also very permissive license. And everything, whether it's the OSPO Alliance or the Good Governance Initiative, is really open to participation for everybody. So,
Thank you
and now
very
if
much.
you have any question,
Yes.
I think that we will maybe have to continue the discussion on our booth or on the OW2 booth, because I'm afraid we are running late.
We have 15 minutes. So
15 minutes, so go ahead.
Yes, we can discuss.
Questions.
So, yet, what?
Do you have in your recommendations about OSPOs some specific points for scientific organizations such as institutes, laboratories, because, for example, they could be using free and open source software much more than they do now, and about also educating all the collaborators about free and open source software. Surprisingly, it's not good enough at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I have to say, we didn't focus there on the academic sector, but I fully recommend you to talk to Said, who is here, and who is the person to talk to about this subject. We fully recommend it for all the public institutions, of course, you know, with all the, you know, like all the considerations. But yeah, I mean, maybe if Said wants to.
I mean, there's no short, easy answer, but it does relate to the culture. So what we've done at Johns Hopkins is argue open source software is a research object, just like articles, just like data. So at that point, the provost and the chief research officer and so on become very involved. They start saying, well, we care about research. If you say, do you care about open source software? They may say yes, they may say no. But do you care about research? They'll say, yes, of course we do. So now the faculty, the students, the administrators are all starting to ask, what can we do to help make this a research object? And how does that get supported by the institution directly? But there's much more we can talk about as well.
Because it could be very similar to those recommendations which you made for universities, for example.
No, it is different, but I think this is one difference for universities, is they focus on software as a research object as well.
Yeah. What I would also like to add, I mean, we took a look at academia. You know, we talked to quite some academics who are either researching open source themselves or working in some part of the university that is taking care of this. And I mean, again, I can just repeat that open culture. So like, I mean, this is our general impression that if the open culture, so like not only open source as such, but just the whole idea of collaboration is present in the institution, there is a much higher chance that there is going to be uptake. And this is extremely difficult and extremely lengthy to introduce it, because the cultural changes take years and years to introduce. But if there are people who are actually working on this, I don't know, for example, university courses, this is one of our recommendations, to implement open source within university courses. Because, it shouldn't only be during, I don't know, programming classes, but, it can be implemented in many other different types of courses. So, there's like this whole array of ways that we recommend, to implement open source or just openness in terms of digital matters throughout the institution.
I started an organization 7 years ago called innersourcecommons.org, which is aimed at proprietary organizations, or organizations that don't claim to be open source, that are trying to fix their old-fashioned ways of engineering. And because I think it's pretty clear that open source develops software faster and arguably at a higher level of quality. So maybe companies are going to want to learn to use that. My real reason for doing it was to create more open source developers by training developers that are not allowed to work in open source now in doing it as part of an urban renewal project inside their company. So it's a sneaky Trojan horse thing that I'm trying to do, but it is exactly a set of guidelines for how to increase collaboration and transparency inside your organization. Because in my consulting, I find 20 years ago, finding companies that were going to be able to figure this out and they just needed a little help was easy. But these days, some of the people who have the best reason to get open source right cannot do it. And it's because of the culture inside their company. So that's why I started InnerSource Commons, was let's take a step back, and before people start trying to fling open source out into the public sector, let's learn how to do it. Because the reason they don't know how is because they have no frame of reference based on their old-fashioned ways of doing engineering.
Yeah, maybe one last comment about research institution. So I think that there is also, it can be influenced by policy and in France earlier this year, there was a publication of the second French National Plan for Open Science. And I think that's important from my perspective, because there is a clear recommendation to make research software available under an open source license. And that's also, you know, the instruction coming from the top that, okay, you should do open source, and of course after that you should do it properly, so in this kind of organized manner. So yeah.
Another question? No?
Ah, there's one.
So all this OSPO thing seems jolly and well for large organizations. What do you do for SMEs? What would you recommend?
Do you want to talk about the research?
I mean, I can just say that, I mean, you know, in terms of just involvement in open source software, what we have found out for our study is that actually the majority of contributions in the European Union are done by SMEs. So, I mean, large organizations usually have much more institutional resources and just resources to figure out the ways to manage different things. But SMEs actually are the ones who are doing this. So I am unsure if OSPOs are, you know, because of course SMEs can be involved in OSPOs, you know, and I mean, there are dedicated organizations for SMEs, and actually, I mean, there's the organization called Appel, which is the organization for the European SMEs that are working on open source, but it's convening the national open source associations for the SMEs in, you know, in the different member states. So, you know, as an SME, what, you know, I mean, probably the good way to go is to contact the national organization and then get involved for this. Because then, I mean, there are many conversations that are happening, and I think the very important part of this is to be a part of the conversation. Because, I mean, we have seen Appel has been there for, I don't know, a year or two?
Yeah.
Years. And the European Commission, for example, is really looking at Appel, and they are really interested in what is happening, because when there is a voice and where is the single just like single face of the given industry or the type of companies, then it's much easier for policymaker to even contact them and actually do something to support them. And then SMEs can come and say, this is our problem, this is the kind of support that we need. For example, I don't know, involve open source in the Horizon Europe funding program or in other funding programs that, are more regional. But then, policymakers can actually make a move and address those needs.
I actually worked for an SME that did a lot of open source during the pandemic, and in fact are the largest single contributor to Node, the JavaScript framework core. And obviously the way that they choose to do that and how that affects their profitability has been much discussed. But what it does is using open source strategy judiciously creates a force multiplier so that you become much more known and much more appreciated for your work, because it's a very effective way of showing people the kind of work you do. They don't open source everything they do. They have lots of customers that want their stuff to stay proprietary that they're paying for. But they try to always have some crumbs of open source in there to continue that reputation, because it's a reputation of engineering excellence. And when you're a consultancy, having that reputation is maybe the edge that gets you that contract. So people do it for different reasons.
If I may add something about, you've been talking about IT companies. So this, and Appel is an association of IT companies. Now what we're doing is addressing the rest of us, so the non-IT, non-technology companies. So as I said, it could be retail industries or transportation companies or local SMEs, locals. And also, although this has been inspired by the work from large organizations, what we do here is basically you can use it at a very low level as a checklist of things you can use. It's a checklist you can use. I mean, we've been thinking of all these IT people in small companies, teams of 4 or 5 IT persons managing the IT department in a smaller company. And there is one, and they need to get involved with open source software, acquire some open source software, or maybe download some community edition and then want to contribute back and get involved into this whole open source way. And this is what we have here. It's something that should be helpful for them.
Leslie?
Go ahead, Leslie.
Yes, thank you. So I think that one of the areas that we are lacking in sort of playbook or guidance material is absolutely for SMEs, because we either have like really great manuals written by US hyperscalers who have unlimited budgets and who will tell you how to create a great open source program office, and it's completely accurate for their use case. Or we have bodies of work and knowledge that are being either have been produced or are produced for academia and public sector entities, and that's really evolving. But for that middle area, I don't think anyone's really addressing that. And I have thought of the term, which I'm sure that I heard from someone who is smarter than me, like how do we help the market understand the minimum viable OSPO? If you have 2 or 3 people at your company who care about open source and understand open source, how do we help guide them so that they're doing the things that the business needs in order to produce return on investment for the business? And I think one of the reasons we haven't actually seen that is when you're in that under-resourced or with fewer resources, you inevitably end up looking at your open source strategy entirely through the lens of risk, right? Like, so how do I make sure that I have an effective license compliance program so that my company doesn't get sued, right? And that's not how people want, that's not how people who are excited about open source like to think about open source, right? They want to think about like, what value will it create? What kind of collaboration opportunities does it produce? So, and I also note that one of the areas where I see a dearth of onboarding is this concept of the drive-by contributor, right? So we have small, medium enterprises, some of whom may even make their money providing support or solutions around open source software. And sometimes they want to take work that they've done for a customer to fix something and contribute it back to the bigger project. They may not know how to do that, or they may only want to do kind of a one-time contribution, and there's a huge barrier to entry to get that code included in the main project, and why bother if it's going to take that much time and you're a really small shop? So how do we sort of bridge that gap for the occasional contributor to be able to provide that improvement? And you know, there are some communities that provide on-ramping or onboarding or buddies or mentorship for that first pull request. But I don't think that that's something, I don't like you either, Mike. I don't think that that's something that we have enough of, and I'd like to see more of that grow. And that's a really great question. Thank you, Philippe.
Okay, thank you very much. I invite you maybe to continue around the coffee.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.